Hello and welcome to Behind the Screen. I am JM, your host, your guide to this show where we sit around and we talk about games, we talk about things that are beautiful, things that inspire us, and especially today in Malazadvent. Welcome to our first stream of Malazadvent, which is a month that we're going to just take a look at talking about Malazan, which is a series of books by Steven Erikson and Ian Esselman, and I'm here to talk to you about kind of an overview and introduction to the series. Now, I think it was about 2004 when I was walking through Borders Books. This is how long ago this was. And I saw this book on the shelf with a red cover, guy riding on a horse, and it said Gardens of the Moon. All right, let's be honest. Working in the role-playing game industry as I do, we judge a lot of books by their cover. But what really grabbed me was the fact that at the bottom of the cover of Gardens of the Moon, there's this little blurb that said, "To anyone who will listen to me, treat yourself and read Gardens of the Moon." And it's weird to me because I think I caught the endorsement out of my eye before I actually saw the cover, because it was by Stephen Donaldson, who wrote the Thomas Covenant Chronicles, which is a massive favorite of mine and has been for many, many years. Tink, good to see you this morning. Thanks for joining us. And joining us on YouTube. This is the first time we're trying to multi-stream, both here on YouTube. So, cheers to all of the people on YouTube who may be tuning in on this. So, I picked it up because I love the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. And if one of my favorite authors, I mean, up until this point, Tolkien and Donaldson were my two favorite fantasy authors. One of those two were going to recommend a series, then by God, I was going to pick it up. And so I didn't know what I was getting into. I jumped into Gardens of the Moon. Ted, thank you for joining us. And Mark as well. So that started my journey into the world of Malaz. And I've always said Malazan because that's what the audiobooks say. But apparently, according to the authors, it's Malaz. Threw me for a loop, but I'm going to try and make my adjustment, especially between now and Thursday, because Thursday afternoon on these channels, I will be interviewing Steven Erikson and Ian Esselman, the two authors of the Malaz series. So I dove into this book and had no clue what was going on, because Erikson is the kind of writer who doesn't believe, it seems like, in explaining something that the two characters wouldn't need to explain to each other. So if you and I were sitting down and we were talking about, the process of buying a Tesla, neither one of us would explain what a Tesla was, or what an electric engine was, or why it came out of the internal combustion engine, or what a Model T was. We would just talk about the Tesla, and anyone who had no clue what we were talking about would be completely lost. And that's what I was. I was completely lost my first read through of this book, but it was so evocative, and it was so interesting, and the characters were well developed, and the world hinted at something beautiful and large. And so I finished Gardens of the Moon and immediately went out and bought Dead House Gates. And I think by the time I finally caught up, I think Bone Hunters was the first book that I purchased, or I was waiting for Bone Hunters or Toll the Hounds I think it was Toll the Hounds to come out. And this series has massively influenced my life. I don't know how to explain it beyond that. It has influenced how I develop worlds, both Jackals and Tanar, were heavily influenced by the Malazan Books of the Fallen and the Malazan Empire. And so I'm going to try and give an introduction to the world of Malaz, to the books that you can get for this, and the main themes in about 30 minutes or less, which seems like a stupidly daunting task, yet here I am, here we are, here's what we're going to be talking about. So there are multiple series within the Malaz. It's not even it's a series of series. It's an entire oeuvre onto itself. So the main sequence is 10 books called the Malazan Books of the Fallen. Yes, John Doom, I'm trying to pronounce it because every time I say Malazan, I hear your dog whisperer kind of right back here. And so that's the main sequence. You have the Tales, or the Malazan Empire, which was written by Ian Esselman. You have, which is 6 books. You have the novels of Bauchelain and Corbald Broach, a necromancer and a demonologist, which are about 6 books as of the time of this recording, which are hysterical. They're just witty and satirical and brutally humorous. And those are kind of the main sequences. And now each of the authors are writing a second, or in Erickson's case, also a tertiary series. In Erickson's case, we're getting the Carcanus trilogy. The first 2 books are done, and that is set hundreds of thousands of years on a completely different world than that of Malaz, one of the other Warrens, which we'll get to in a second. Thank you, Trollord Games Chuck and Griffin. This is fantastic. Thank you so much for the subscription. And then he's also writing a series after the Malazan Books of the Fallen called the Witness Trilogy, which follows Karsa, who is one of the main characters of the Books of the Fallen. And then Esselmont, having finished his Malazan Empire series, is now writing a, I think, open-ended series called Paths of Ascendancy, which acts as kind of a prequel to both the Malazan Empire and the Malazan Books of the Fallen. So, something like 30 books and a couple of short stories, and soon to cross that threshold in the near future. And so, most of these tales are set on one of 3 continents in the world that fans have dubbed Wu, and follows the exploits mainly of agents of the Malazan Empire. I have often said that this is military fantasy in the same way that Game of Thrones is sort of political fantasy. It follows multiple squads, multiple armies, multiple commanders spread out across 3 continents in Books of the Fallen, and that expands to, I think, by 3 more in the Empire series. And yet, both authors have a way of weaving their stories together. So if you read Books of the Fallen, each book is self-contained, but builds on the one that's before it until you reach the Crippled God, and I would say 80% of the storylines tie together there. And the other 20% are resolved in the Empire books. So it's a world of high fantasy. It's a world of, and when I say high fantasy, we are talking beyond the Forgotten Realms. Your first introduction to the world is giant hounds tearing apart giant magical hounds tearing apart a company of soldiers and a god possessing a young fisher girl, and then it jumps to a fight between the army and a flying fortress inhabited by these dark-skinned elf-like creatures known as the Tistiandi. They're unleashing Warrens, which are truly magical in the sense of that they provoke wonder and enchantment. They are both a path to magic and a parallel dimension and a source of entities, as well as thrones and dominions which gods can take over. And some of them are broken and some of them are older than the Warrens. And there are layers on layers on layers. And what we're going to look at over the next 3 behind the screens is we're really going to look at the Books of the Fallen. I've tried to organize them into some sort of large theme, or looking at 10 books, each 600 to 1,000 pages, and trying to figure out how to organize them is beyond the realm of sanity, but I think I've managed to do it. We're going to talk about them by continent stories. So we're going to talk about Genebacchus on Thursday, which is books 1, 3, and 8. And then next Tuesday, we're going to talk about Seven Cities, which is books 2, 4, and 6. And then we'll wrap up with Lether, which is books 5, 7, 9, and 10. So, Rook, good to see you, my friend. So it's interesting to me, and why I think this series has captured my imagination. And when I say captured my imagination, I'm currently in book 3 of my 7th or 8th reread of the 10-book sequence. You can buy a copy on ebook on Kindle, which has all 10 books as one file. And every time I go through, I add more annotations as I catch new things. So on the surface, it is military fiction. It follows multiple campaigns across multiple continents against multiple different foes. The first book is really about the claiming of Darujistan. Book 3 about the defeat of the Paniondomen. Book 2 and 4 really deal with the Seven Cities area being in revolt to the Malazan Empire. Then we jump over to Lether, and eventually the Malazan Empire comes to Lether and invades that. And so on the surface, it's about soldiers. It's about soldiers and gods. And what it would be like to actually be a soldier in a world where mages call down coruscating waves of golden light from hills of power versus demigods enthroned in flying fortresses. In a world where elder races exist that exist on an entirely different scale of power than the rest of the world. You do have god soldiers. You have soldiers you have people that can ascend to godhood. You have ancient enmities, like the war that's been going on for hundreds of thousands of years between the Talana Mas and the Jaghut, 2 different races. Roughly a species that hated, the Talana Mas hated their enemies so much that they cursed themselves to undeath so that they could track down every last Jaghut, which is sort of maybe an orc ogre-ish type of species, to the ends of the earth and ensure their extinction. It's also bizarre on levels that I can't even explain. In book 3, one of the main antagonists is an undead dinosaur creature with swords for arms, and yet is never seen as silly or bizarre in the writing. Esselmont's books have automata soldiers and armor that is actually insects that burrow into somebody's body to create, the cloaking of armor, and hysterical thieves that are really more like barbarians. And there is beauty and there's horror, and there are scenes that no matter how many times I read them, reduce me to tears. I'm going to get more into the nitty-gritty on Thursday, but this is really our high-level look. So, there are 2 main themes that I think really pervade the series. And a lot of people want to throw the Malazan series into dark fantasy or grimdark fantasy, and I push back against both of them. While there is darkness, I believe Stephen Erickson is an anthropologist by trade and knows the darkness that lurks in the hearts of men over the course of human history. I would argue that the main theme of the Books of the Fallen is that compassion is what makes us human. In book 3, and I'm paraphrasing, there is a quote by a shield anvil. So in the world of Malaz, the gods tend to have 3 main priestly roles. You have the mortal sword, which is kind of your paladin, your avenging fist and sword of the god on the mortal plane. You have the destriant, which is really more of your priestly role. And then you have something that's the shield anvil, which, from what I'm able to glean over multiple readings of the book, essentially guards the souls of those who are dedicated to the god. So they kind of stand as the guardian of the honored dead. And we meet one in book 3, Itkovian. And we meet this shield anvil during the siege of a city called Kapistan by one of the most horrifically evil empires I have ever read. The Paniandoman, who not only just brutalizes their enemies, but their own people, turning them into scavengers and worse that I just won't even describe on the channel at this point. And yet, Itkovian continually meets evil with compassion, offering to take their trauma and their pain and absorb it into himself. And there's this moment, I don't want to spoil it because I know several of the people in chat are reading book 3, but there's this moment where Itkovian is talking to one of these Talanamas, one of these undead who have been defined by their hatred for hundreds of thousands of years. And he says, compassion is priceless in the truest sense of the word. We must give it away as often as we can to whomever we can. And Itkovian's storyline is about compassion. It threads from book 3 all the way to book 8. There are massive changes in the world. A group ascends in the second half of the book, all because of an act of compassion by one of their members in book 2. In the middle of this rebellion, Fiddler takes the time to save 2 girls from being kidnapped and off the street and sold into slavery and human trafficking. And that one act, and even he kicks himself. He's like, don't get involved. Why would I get involved? And he can't help it because no one in that moment could help it. That sets him and an entire course of life-altering events because of one moment of compassion. And indeed, the climax of the series is not about forgiveness. It's about compassion, and how compassion is what truly defines us as humans. If we lose the ability to offer compassion to people, even those that we have a right to hate, we don't lessen them, we lessen ourselves. And so to have a 10-book series whose one of whose primary themes is compassion, set against the backdrop of military fiction and military fantasy, is the primary reason that I would argue that it is not grimdark. Because, as Mark pointed out, Joe Abercrombie is grimdark. Richard K. Morgan's A Land Fit for Heroes. That's grimdark. R. Scott Baker, who I came to specifically because Erickson recommended him on the front of The Darkness That Comes Before, is grimdark. Grimdark ends as brutally, as disgustingly, as awfully as you can imagine, because the author's point of view is this is how the world works. I would argue that, at least the way it is going, Game of Thrones is grimdark. Any shred of decency is a weakness to be exploited and ruined. Right? The only truly decent man in the first book is beheaded because of his decency. And we see that kind of as a reoccurring thing. Honor is worthless. It takes a sociopath to survive in Westeros. In the world of Wu, in Malaz, it is this beautiful thing that compassion continues to define us as a species. And man, I could just talk about this forever. I could just sit for the next 6 hours and talk about my favorite scenes. The brutality of the chain of dogs, the humor of Boschlane and Corbel Broach and Fiddler and Gessler and Stormy, the tragedy of Bottle, the humor of the fact that Malazan Marines swear by attributes the gods do not have. So if you haven't picked up on this, Rook and John and Tink, look at all of the Malaz curses. Hood's breath. Hood is the god of the dead. Hood's balls. Hood always appears as a skeleton. Burn's mercy. Burn is the earth. They swear by attributes the gods do not possess. And that is just spectacular to me. So if you enjoy high fantasy, if you want a lot of magic, if you enjoy what would be considered a softer magic system, if you enjoy some of the most intense world building, like about 300,000 years of history just on this dimension, not counting the Tisti, who go back to a completely different warren of existence. If you like plots that are self-contained yet build and weave towards a greater whole, this is not like The Wheel of Time, where after about book 2, the books just end, but the story continues, for there are no beginnings nor endings in The Wheel of Time. The first 8 books each have a focused story with a beginning, middle, and ending. Actually, multiple stories, each with a beginning, middle, and ending. Book 9 is the only one that has a cliffhanger because it just got too large and he had to split it into 2 books. Yes. Oh, if you enjoy military matters, most of the books come with maps that kind of help you track the sieges and the military movements throughout the books. The Chain of Dogs being just gut-wrenching. The Siege of Kapustan being another one that's just awful. Don't even get me started on the Snake from Dust of Dreams, or Yigatan and the Bone Hunters. If you like getting attached to characters and being sad, as Tink says, there's this great meme where, because apparently George R. R. Martin had said, and this could be apocryphal, but this was in the meme, and I think I've heard this before, that he started adding characters in that he knew the audience would like just to kill them off in his books. And then, so you got that quote with a picture of Martin, and then you have a picture of Erickson where it just is laughter. Because your favorite characters won't die once in Malaz. They will have multiple rough paths to their happy ending. And sometimes their happy ending is happy for them, and you are still left with this one's to Talk the Younger. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go read Gardens of the Moon. If you want a slightly easier... Now, I will say this. Gardens of the Moon has a very difficult entry point. You are just dropped into the world at a random spot, and then the story picks up. And while there is a story that threads through Gardens of the Moon, you will be left with more questions than answers. Hands down, no questions asked. By about the midway through Deadhouse Gates, you got a good grip on the world. Erickson in book 2 kind of helps flesh that out a bit. But that's not the only starting point to Malaz. You could start with the Tales of the Malazan Empire, which starts with Knight of Knives, which is a prequel. The Knight of Knives is sort of being discussed in Gardens of the Moon. Now, I will say, if you read Knight of Knives, one of the big mysteries of Gardens of the Moon will be spoiled, but I don't think it's that big of a deal. In fact, there's a really interesting way to read the Malaz series where you jump between the two series, because there are definitely chronological events that are referenced between the two, and you can kind of set up, okay, I'm going to read Knight of Knives, then these 4 books, then jump over to Return of the Crimson Guard, then these books, then jump over to Stonewielder and Orb, Scepter, and Throne after Toll the Hounds, but not before I read Dust of Dreams, and then Jakaruku, which is Blood and Bone, and then finish with Assail. To those of you reading it right now who are part of the Iconic Discord, I have good news and I have bad news. When you finish book 3, you're going to want to know what happens to Silver Fox. The good news is you get a resolution. The bad news is not in Books of the Fallen. It's the last book of the Malazan Empire, where Assail, where we get the answers to what happens to Silver Fox. So yeah, that's my rambly overview of the Malazan Books of the Fallen. It's a lot. Again, I've read it through 7 or 8 times, so it doesn't feel as daunting to me, but I know that John and Rook and Tink are reading through it, and it's so good. Yes, John Doom. It is basically Dwarf Fortress in book form. That is a great game. I should stream some Dwarf Fortress someday. That game is amazing. Tink says, at least when Erickson is presumably using his emotional manipulation of the reader to teach us important lessons. I think we glean important lessons. I don't ever feel like Malazan gets preachy, if that makes sense. Silver Fox could have been a much easier time if they would have just talked to people. Yes, this is the root of all of my problems with CW TV shows. Just, especially after season 1, where they all get to the end and they're like, we have learned to talk to each other, because that is how we would have avoided all of season 1. And then season 2 starts, it's like, we're not talking to each other again. God darn it, people. So, recap. At its core, the Malazan books are high fantasy, character-driven, with deep world-building. They are about military fantasy, looking at empires and soldiers, but also really about how compassion is the defining trait of humanity, and also how power attracts power. That's a theme that you'll constantly come back to. And it makes me think about how often do we escalate in our own lives without realizing that escalation inevitably brings more escalation. There are 30 books, so if you like to invest in a series, probably 29 at this point, but I think we're going to... Erickson is wrapping up the second Witness book, which is called No Life Forsaken, I believe, which is just a heartbreaking title if you understand who Karsa is. And we'll talk about Karsa when we get to the Seven Cities arc. And is also going to wrap up the Carcanis trilogy with Walk in Shadow, which I have been desperately awaiting for many years. And then Esselmont has the next, I think, 1 or 2 Paths of Ascendancy books in the works, and there's another Bauchelain and Corval Broach short story. I just discovered today that all 6 Bauchelain and Corval Broach novels are on Audible in 2 volumes, so I'm probably going to be snagging those over the next couple of months. So if you see me on the street and I'm laughing at something, it's probably because I'm listening to Boschelane and Corball Brooch. Quick asking, is this spoilers? If so, up to what point? I have tried to remain spoiler-free through this whole video. I'm going to try and remain, give very clear spoilers going forward. Oh, Crippled God, no spoilers up until, no spoilers for Crippled God. This has been very high-level discussion, Bob. Glad to have you on the stream. Let me know what you think of the Crippled God. It was, especially after Dust of Dreams. To those of you reading for the first time, let me just say, much like my son, who gets to enjoy all of Babylon 5 at once, or all of Doctor Who, or any of the TV shows that we're watching, you will not experience the pain of the cliffhanger of Dust of Dreams, knowing that the next book won't be out for an entire year. Yes. Oh, okay, so the Twitch chat seems to have some spoilers. Don't read the Twitch chat. Now, I will say yes, that's awesome. Thanks for Tink for posting those on Reddit. We will be talking about the Genebakian arc in more detail on Thursday, so there will be spoilers on Thursday. If you have not read Gardens of the Moon, Memories of Ice, and Toll the Hounds, as well as Orb, Throne, and Scepter. So I will try and keep the spoilers well placed in the discussion so that people can ignore the episode if they need to. So that's our discussion for our overview of Malazan, our Malazan Books of the Fallen and Malazan Empire. It's a lot. I realize this, like I have my outline in front of me and it still felt rambly because the series is so huge. But Thursday is a huge deal for me. You may be wondering, JM, Behind the Screen is a gaming podcast. Why are you talking about this fantasy book? Well, two reasons. One, it's my podcast and I can talk about what I want, and we're doing a big Malazadvent push because I think the series is beautiful and inspires us. Two, I will be talking about how to gamify each arc as we talk on Thursday and next week. But three, for those of you who don't know, the Malazan world and stories came out of Erickson and Esselmont's games. They played through these things. It started as an AD&D game that quickly was converted to GURPS as soon as they discovered GURPS. And if you know GURPS, then the Warrens suddenly make a whole lot more sense. It's also why some characters are really powerful, because they were high-end Dungeons & Dragons characters, especially some of the Elder Races characters, and some are far more grounded. If you read through the books, you will start to see themes and groups of characters that really feel like a gaming group. If I remember correctly from the multiple of interviews that I have read and looked at, the Bridge Burners, the Bone Hunters, the group centered around Krupp in Darujistan, several of the characters throughout the Malazan Empire series were all played at the table. The original group that founds the Empire, which is the story of Paths of Ascendancy. So Sari and Kellenved and Dancer and Dasim Ultor and Whiskey Jack and Dujek One Arm. Those were player characters. And yes, there is an entire article on Erickson's website about how Karsa was a player character. Somebody wanted to join the game and he wanted to play a barbarian. And for those of you who are going to be getting into House of Chains or who have read through House of Chains, as I understand it, Erickson never told the player that Toblakai were giants. So when he told the player, you're on your quest to go down into the lowlands and kill a bunch of children, he had no idea that he was a giant and looked at everyone else as a child until he played through and got down there, which is the dickest move that I've ever heard of a GM pulling, and I love it. Trivia like they listened to the song Doctor Who when they played. Yes, it is incredibly cool. I don't know if The Witch was a PC as well. But yes, the gaming stories are so good. So tune in on Thursday at 2 o'clock on the channel. We'll be here and we'll be on YouTube. I get to talk with Steven and Ian, and I'm going to be kind of gaming focused. Like, we're going to talk about the themes of compassion and power. We're going to talk about the origins of the series in the gaming, what they played, what were their favorite moments, did those translate well. We're going to talk about maybe some advice on, hey, if you were going to take something you ran, what advice could you give someone who wants to convert their campaign into a novel series? And then, of course, what is up in the future, what in the future for Malaz. So I'm so excited about that. I am literally vibrating. I am so excited about talking with these two authors. So that'll be Thursday in the afternoon, 2 o'clock Central, spread out time zone wise from there. I am way over what I normally do on one of these shows. So to everyone who has joined us new on YouTube, it seems to be a success to have gone live on YouTube. So to everyone who has joined, thank you for joining us. To everyone who normally shows up, to John and Tink and Rook and Mark, thank you so much for joining. I will be back on Thursday with more behind the screens. Yes! Bob, I'm glad that you are here. I feel like we're going to enjoy talking with these guys on Thursday. When I say we, I hope to be able to post questions that you have and ask them during the interview. So if you have questions that you've always wanted to ask Erickson or Esselman, please show up on Tuesday. If you're on the Iconic Discord, post them in the Malazadvent channel so that we can record them there, or on Reddit. I know that Tink is aggregating some of those questions. So until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. I am JM. This has been Behind the Screen, and I will see you all on Thursday. Until then, have a good one.